What happens when a single, reckless moment shatters a lifetime of control? For Margot, life was a blueprint. Every line was perfect, every angle calculated, and her ambition was the skyscraper she was building day by day. She was the master of her own design. But one afternoon, stuck in the city's suffocating grip, she broke her own rules. A flirtatious challenge to a mysterious stranger on a motorcycle, a brief, thrilling taste of chaos in her world of order. She had no way of knowing he was Caspian Gallo, the Shadow, the city's phantom king, a man whose empire was built in the silence between secrets, and whose power was absolute. He wasn't just a man. He was the architect of a world she never knew existed, and her ambition had just made her the centerpiece of his most dangerous design. This is a story of ambition and obsession, of a woman who built her own cage, and the man who held the only key. A tale where a chance encounter was never chance at all, and where surrendering control could be the most powerful move of all. So dim the lights, hold your breath, and let's discover what happens when the architect meets the king. Comment with the emoji if you believe some risks are worth taking. Subscribe for more cinematic stories of dangerous attraction, hidden empires, and the intoxicating thrill of losing control. Because sometimes, the greatest prison isn't the one built around you. It's the perfect life you're desperate to escape. Control was Margot's religion. She was its most devout follower, finding salvation in the clean lines of a floor plan, in the rigid schedule of a project met, in the predictability of her meticulously orchestrated days. Her life was a skyscraper of her own design, ambitious, flawless on the outside, and built on a foundation of iron discipline. Today, however, that foundation was trembling. The city of Chicago suffocated under the weight of an August afternoon. The sun beat down on the asphalt, turning it into a panting black mirror that distorted the air into waves. Inside her German sedan, the air conditioning sighed a lukewarm breath, a pathetic attempt to combat the heat seeping through the windows. She was stuck, a metaphor almost too cruel for how she had been feeling for the past few months. Her nails, painted a discreet and professional nude, drummed an unsteady rhythm against the leather of the steering wheel. 1, 2, 3 quick taps. Pause. The symphony of horns outside was an echo of the cacophony in her mind. The client's email, Mr. Peterson's, burned in her memory. The passive-aggressive words dissecting weeks of her work with the precision of a scalpel. Minor adjustments, he had called them. Margot knew it would mean sleepless nights. Again. She closed her eyes for a moment, the back of her neck damp with sweat. She felt like one of her scale models, perfect, precise, but trapped under a glass dome, watched and judged. Control, her deity, was demanding too many sacrifices. That was when the sound cut through the monotony. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of a sport bike, nor the rattle of an old engine. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound that didn't ask for passage but took it. Margot opened her eyes. Gliding through the narrow corridor between the lines of stopped cars came a motorcycle. It was black, but the color seemed insufficient to describe it. It was a black that absorbed light, a slice of night moving under the merciless sun. The machine's lines were aggressive and elegant, a panther of chrome and steel. A Ducati, she noted with her architect's eye, but customized, stripped of everything non-essential. Pure function, pure power. The rider was an extension of the machine. Wrapped in black leather from head to toe, he moved with a predatory grace, navigating the chaos with a calm that was almost an insult to everyone else's agitation. There was no hurry in his movements, only an inevitable certainty. He stopped exactly beside Margot's window, the engine vibrating in a deep purr that she felt more than heard, a resonance that traveled through her car's chassis and up her spine. She couldn't see his face, hidden by a dark, unadorned helmet, its visor a black mirror reflecting her own distorted image. Even so, she felt his weight, his presence. It was as if the gravity around him were stronger. While the other drivers fidgeted, prisoners in their metal boxes, he seemed the only free man in the world. Something inside Margot, a gear she had kept firmly locked for years, came loose. It was the frustration with Peterson, the oppressive heat, the sight of that insolent freedom beside her. A bubble of rebellion rose in her throat, hot and unexpected. A reckless thought formed in her mind, and to her own horror, she heard it slip past her lips, her voice a little louder than intended to be heard over the traffic's hum. "Nice machine," she said. The words hung in the heavy air between them. He didn't move. For a second, she felt a wave of humiliation. Had he even heard her? Of course not. He was in his own world. She should roll up the window, focus on the traffic light, go back to her life of straight lines. But then, his head turned. Slowly. It wasn't a sudden movement of surprise, but a deliberate, controlled turn. He faced her, or at least the helmet turned in her direction faced her. The silence that followed was more intense than any horn. The world seemed to hold its breath. Margot felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a beat out of sync in her symphony of control. "What have you done?" A voice in her head hissed. "You don't talk to strangers. You're not that kind of woman." His gloved hand rose, not to wave, but to his visor. With a soft click, he lifted it. Just a few inches. Just enough. The afternoon sun didn't reach his whole face, leaving most of it in shadow, but his eyes found hers. They were gray. Not a soft gray, but the color of a storm gathering over the ocean, cold and deep, and full of a dangerous intelligence. And below them, a smile formed. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smirk, a wry slash in a face that seemed carved from stone, one that said he knew things. Maybe he even knew about the mutiny that had just occurred inside her. He didn't say a word. The silence was his answer, a silence that disarmed her completely. It was more magnetic, more arrogant, and infinitely more intriguing than any sentence he could have spoken. That silence assessed her, acknowledged her, and dismissed her, all in the same instant. The light ahead turned green. The smirk vanished. The visor snapped down with another click, sealing him back in his world. The growl of the engine deepened into a roar that vibrated in Margot's chest. And then, he was gone. He didn't speed away wildly. He simply flowed into the moving traffic, a shadow merging with other shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Margot remained still, even as the car behind her honked impatiently. The air in her car felt different, charged with an electricity that wasn't there before. She could feel a hot blush creeping up her neck, betraying the calm she tried to project. Her hands, previously steady, now trembled slightly on the wheel. She pressed the accelerator, the movement mechanical, her body acting while her mind was still stopped beside that motorcycle. The entire encounter had lasted no more than 30 seconds, but it had left a fissure in her carefully constructed reality. He hadn't said anything, and yet she felt as if they had had an entire conversation, a dangerous one. She shook her head, trying to clear the image of those gray eyes. It was madness, a moment of stress. It meant nothing. She had work to do. She had the Valeriano Tower to design, the biggest contract of her career, a project that would cement her at the top. She needed control. She needed focus. But as she drove, the echo of that motorcycle's engine reverberated within her, a persistent low note that promised a kind of chaos she had never allowed herself to know. And for the first time in a long time, the perfection of her straight lines felt terribly, unbearably dull. 2 weeks, 14 days, 336 hours. Margot tried to bury the memory of that encounter under the weight of her work, layer by layer of CAD blueprints, endless meetings, and the omnipresent scent of strong coffee and printed paper. The mysterious biker became an anomaly, a miscalculation that her logical mind struggled to file away and forget. But he refused to go. Sometimes, in the silence of her minimalist apartment, with the Chicago skyline lit up beyond her panoramic windows, the memory would assault her. The growl of the engine, the stormy gray of those eyes. She would feel a phantom echo of that vibration in her chest, a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was irritating. It was a distraction she couldn't afford. Not now. The Valeriano Tower project was her obsession. It was more than steel and glass. It was her legacy. A 70-story needle of luxury and power that would pierce the sky, an indelible testament to her vision. The competition had been brutal, the city's top architectural firms fighting like wolves over a prize. But Margot's proposal had been different, bolder. She hadn't just designed a building, she'd designed an experience, a fortress of exclusivity and opulence. The clients were a Swiss investment conglomerate called Argentum Holdings. They were discreet to the point of secrecy. All communication was handled through a team of impassive lawyers in Geneva. There was no face to the money, just a name on a contract and stratospheric expectations. For Margot, this was perfect. No egos to massage, no faces to please. Just the pure pursuit of architectural perfection. That morning, the ozonic scent of a recent rain shower hung over the city. Margot was in her conference room, the cool, conditioned air a contrast to the humidity outside. A miniature model of the Valeriano Tower, printed in white resin, occupied the center of the polished mahogany table like an idol on an altar. She and her small team, David and Chloe, were going over the plans for the 100th time. The deep caisson foundation is the only logical option with the proximity to the river, David said, his finger tracing a blue line on the blueprint. But the costs... The costs are not an issue, Margot cut him off, her voice calm and firm. Argentum made that clear. They want the best, not the cheapest. Still, Chloe chimed in, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses. It's odd. I've never seen a client so... absent. They've approved everything, every over-budget item, every exotic material without a single question. Who are these people? Margot shrugged, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. They're wealthy people who value their privacy, and who trust our expertise. That's all we need to know. But deep down, Chloe's question echoed an unease Margot had been ignoring. There was a strange sense of inevitability to it all. From the initial approval of her audacious design, to the way every bureaucratic hurdle seemed to dissolve before she even faced it. It felt less like an achievement and more like a script. A lie she told herself, that control was still in her hands. That evening, to celebrate the final zoning approval, the team went to a cocktail lounge atop a boutique hotel. The place was dark and intimate, with velvet armchairs and a stunning view of the city lights. Margot allowed herself a rare moment of relaxation, the taste of an expensive gin and tonic sharpening her senses. The conversation flowed, light and satisfied. For the first time in weeks, she felt genuinely at peace. She excused herself to get another round from the bar, enjoying the brief solitude. As she waited, her gaze drifted across the crowded room. And then, it stopped. Across the room, in a more secluded and shadowy booth, a man was watching her. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a fixed, penetrating stare, a beam of intensity in the dim light. He was in a suit, a dark fabric that seemed molded to his body. The light was faint, but she didn't need it to recognize him. She recognized the stillness, the aura of contained power, and above all, the eyes. Even at a distance, she felt the same color, the same depth. Storm gray. It was him, the biker. Margot's heart gave a painful leap, and then seemed to stop altogether. The glass in her hand grew cold, the condensation on her skin suddenly chilling. A low hum started in her ears, muffling the sound of conversations and ambient music. The air grew thin. Impossible, her mind screamed. A coincidence. In a city of 3 million people, it couldn't be. It was madness. He wasn't alone. 2 other men were with him, standing, not sitting. They weren't talking, just watching. Their posture wasn't that of friends or colleagues. It was that of guardians, sentinels. The way their suits fit suggested something more than muscle underneath. He leaned forward, picking up a lowball glass from the table. The light from a small candle flickered across his face. There were no more shadows, no more visor. It was a strong, angular face, with a sharp jaw and a mouth that seemed naturally set in a serious line. He wasn't classically handsome. He was something more dangerous. He was attractive in the way a seaside cliff is attractive, majestic, but promising a fatal drop. He raised the glass in her direction. a silent toast across the crowded room. And then, the corner of his mouth curved up. The same smirk. That wry slash that had disarmed her in traffic. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Margot's fog of shock. This was no coincidence. Coincidences were random, messy. This was precise, intentional. He knew who she was. Did he know she would be here? The idea was absurd, paranoid, and yet... She turned abruptly, her back to him, her heart hammering. Her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the bar, her knuckles turning white. "Miss, your order?" The bartender's voice startled her. "Nothing. I've changed my mind," she mumbled, her voice hoarse. She returned to her table, her face a mask of normalcy that cost every ounce of her willpower to maintain. "Margot, you're pale. Everything okay?" Chloe asked, concern in her eyes. "Yes, just a little dizzy. The heat, maybe," she lied, the excuse flimsy even to her own ears. She didn't dare look toward the booth again, but she could feel him. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight on her back. The evening's peace had been shattered. The lounge, once cozy, now felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to hide secrets. That night, in her apartment, she searched. The information was fragmented, whispered in old newspaper articles and obscure forums. The Gallo family, a Chicago crime dynasty that dated back to Prohibition. They were ghosts. Their names rarely appeared on formal charges, but they loomed like a dark legend over the city's business, both legitimate and illicit. And the heir, the current boss since his father's death, was an enigma. His name was Caspian Gallo, known in certain circles only as the Shadow, for his aversion to publicity and his brutal efficiency. Margot sat in the darkness, the laptop screen illuminating her terrified face. There was a photo, a single grainy paparazzi shot, taken outside a funeral years ago. It was him. The same face. The same eyes. The truth fell upon her, heavy and suffocating. The biker who had made her feel alive, the man in the bar who had made her feel hunted, and the unseen power that had paved the way for the project of her life. They were all the same person. The Valeriano Tower. The name echoed in her mind, mocking her. Valeriano. An old, elegant Italian name. A facade. Just like Argentum Holdings. She wasn't building a tower for a Swiss conglomerate. She was building a palace for the mafia boss of Chicago, and he had been watching her from the very beginning. The architect who idolized control realized, with a chilling horror, that she had never had any control at all. She was just another piece on a board she didn't even know existed, and the player was a ghost with storm-gray eyes. The night was a succession of long, sleepless hours. Margot lay in her bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets, usually a comfort, feeling coarse and foreign against her skin. Every creak of the building, every distant siren in the city, was a signal, a threat. The Chicago skyline, which she had always seen as a field of opportunity, now looked like a concrete jungle, and she had just discovered that the predator at the top of the food chain knew her by name. Her mind, trained to find patterns and solutions, was spinning out of control. She replayed every interaction, every email, every document related to the Valeriano project. In retrospect, the signs were all there, like ghostwriting appearing under a new light. The ease with which the permits were issued. The lack of any real competition in the final phase. The project's name, Valeriano, sounding so deliberately noble and ancient. A perfect disguise. Caspian Gallo. The Shadow. The panic was a nauseating wave, but beneath it, something else began to form. Anger. A cold, sharp anger. She was no damsel in distress. She was Margot, the architect who built her career from nothing, who fought in a world dominated by men, who never asked anyone for help. And she had been played, manipulated. Her greatest professional achievement revealed as a gift from a dark king she didn't even know existed. The humiliation burned hotter than the fear. As dawn broke, the gray light found her on her feet, already dressed for work. an untouched cup of coffee in her hands. A decision had solidified amidst the chaos of her thoughts. She would not run. Running was what he would expect. Running was an admission of defeat. She would go to the final meeting scheduled for that morning, the meeting to sign the construction contracts. She would face him, not with accusations, but with the only weapon she possessed, her unshakable professionalism. She would show him that she could not be bought or intimidated. The Chicago office of Argentum Holdings was on the top floor of a historic downtown building. There was no plaque on the door, just a discreet suite number in polished brass. The air inside was thin and silent, the carpet so thick it completely muffled the sound of her heels. A receptionist of icy beauty led her down a hallway to a conference room with a view that rivaled her own apartments. The Swiss lawyers were there, the same impassive faces as always, seated on one side of a black glass table. Margot sat on the other, opening her leather portfolio with hands that, to her relief, were steady. She felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a dull war drum. "You are in control," she repeated to herself. "This is your domain." "Miss Margot," said the lead lawyer, his German accent precise. "We are just waiting for our client's main representative to finalize the proceedings." Margot merely nodded, her mouth dry. She braced herself for the entrance of some other proxy, another anonymous face. The door to the room opened without a sound, and Caspian Gallo walked in. The shock, even expected, was a physical blow. He sucked the air out of the room. In person, under the bright morning light, his presence was overwhelming. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit his broad shoulders with tailored perfection. There was no jewelry, save for a heavy, understated watch on his wrist. His steps were silent, his movement fluid. He didn't enter the room. He occupied it. The lawyers rose to their feet instantly. Margot remained seated, an act of defiance that cost her immense energy. He ignored the others, his gray eyes finding hers across the table. There was no ironic smirk from before. His face was devoid of expression, a mask of cold politeness that was somehow more intimidating. He looked older, more dangerous than the man in the bar. This was not the predator watching from the shadows. This was the king in his throne room. He took a seat at the head of the table, the gesture casual yet unquestionably dominant. "Please continue." His voice was a calm baritone, but with a low timbre that seemed to vibrate in the glass of the table. The lawyer cleared his throat, clearly nervous. "Sir, this is Miss Margot, the lead architect for the project." Caspian turned his head slowly toward her. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face as if seeing her for the first time. It was a masterful performance, and inside, Margot's rage burned. He was enjoying this. He reached for the folder in front of him and opened it, pretending to read the cover. "Miss..." He paused, his eyes still on the paper, a deliberate insult. "Margot, it's a pleasure. I've heard you have an eye for beautiful designs." The words fell into the silence of the room. Each one weighted with its hidden meaning. Beautiful designs, like the custom motorcycle. The connection was made. An invisible electric current crackling between them. He was telling her he knew, that he had always known. Adrenaline cut through Margot's fog of fear. Anger gave her clarity. She looked directly at him, her chin held high. "And I've heard Argentum Holdings values discretion," she replied, her voice perfectly steady. "It's a quality I also admire in a client." A flicker of something surprise, respect, flashed in his eyes before it was gone. A corner of his mouth twitched for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to push back. "Discretion is the foundation of any successful venture," he said, closing the folder. "As is faith in your partner's vision. And we have immense faith in your vision, Miss Margot." He leaned forward, the focus of the entire room contracting onto him. "Which is why we are ready to sign." It was a checkmate. He had her cornered. If she backed out now, it would create questions, suspicion. It would be a direct insult to the most dangerous man in the city. The consequences would be unthinkable, not just for her career, but perhaps for her safety. If she signed, she would be binding herself to him, becoming an accomplice, his personal architect of crime. The pen was placed in front of her, a heavy, cold Mont Blanc. She looked down at the contract, the clauses and numbers blurring before her eyes. But she didn't see the text. She saw his face, the smirk in the traffic, the stare in the bar. She saw the web he had meticulously woven around her. She felt his gaze on her, intense, questioning. He wasn't just asking for a signature, he was demanding a surrender. With a nearly imperceptible breath, Margot picked up the pen. The metal was cool against her fingers. She uncapped it with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Her hand moved with a surgeon's precision, her signature flowing and confident. A last act of defiance in the midst of capitulation. She signed her name. As she looked up, her eyes met Caspian's, and for the first time, she saw a genuine smile on his face. It wasn't ironic or cold. It was the smile of a player who had just won a game his opponent didn't even know she was playing. Margot's world, once a structure of straight lines and precise angles, now had a new center of gravity, and he was sitting at the head of the table, watching her as if she were his newest, most valuable acquisition. Signing that contract felt like leaping off a cliff, hoping the fall would either kill her or teach her how to fly. In the days that followed, Margot felt as if she were suspended in midair, in a nauseating limbo. She threw herself into her work with a ferocity bordering on desperation, using the complex angles and load calculations of the Valeriano Tower as a shield against the reality her life had become. Work was the only thing that still made sense, the only area where she felt a remnant of control. She didn't hear from Caspian Gallo. There were no phone calls, no emails, no chance encounters. His silence was more unsettling than any communication. It was the silence of a spider waiting patiently in its web. He had made his move. Now, it seemed, he was waiting for her to make hers. Margot's team noticed a change in her. Her usual assertive confidence had sharpened into a brittle intensity. She was more demanding, more focused, less tolerant of mistakes. "Margot, you need to breathe," David said one afternoon, finding her hunched over the structural plans, the glow of the computer screen reflected in her tired eyes. "You've been here for 12 hours. "The schedule is tight," she replied without looking up, the excuse weak. "We make the schedule. Are you punishing yourself for something?" he asked gently. The question hit her with the force of a punch. Yes, she was punishing herself. For her naivety. For her blind ambition. For being so easily played. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm just ensuring perfection, David. It's what they're paying for." The call came on a Thursday evening. Margot was in her apartment, trying in vain to focus on a sketch of an atrium, when her personal phone rang. Blocked number. Her heart leaped, and then began to beat in a heavy, slow rhythm. She answered, her hand trembling. "Margot." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. His voice was unmistakable, a calm baritone that sounded closer, more intimate through the phone. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she expected. "Caspian Gallo, I hope I'm not disturbing you." The politeness was a sham, a thin layer of varnish over steel. "That depends on the reason for your call, Mr. Gallo." There was a pause, and she could hear the faint sound of ice clinking in a glass. He was relaxed, in control. "I believe business dinners are a necessary formality to solidify new partnerships, and we, Miss Margot, are now partners. A car will be at your door in an hour." It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Her instinct screamed at her to refuse, to hang up, to build a wall. But she knew it would be useless. Saying no to this man was not an option. It was merely postponing the inevitable. "I'll be ready," she said, the capitulation leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. An hour later, an unmarked black sedan with windows so dark they looked opaque pulled up in front of her building. The driver, a large man with a boxer's face, got out and opened the door for her without a word. The ride was silent, gliding through the streets of Chicago like a ghost. The restaurant was none of the trendy establishments Margot knew. It was an old, discreet place on a quiet street, with a brick facade and a single oak door. Upon entering, she realized why. It was empty. completely. The tables were set with white linen and silver cutlery, the candles lit, but there were no other patrons, no waiters in sight. Only Caspian, standing near a table in the center of the room, watching her. He wore a dark shirt, no tie, the sleeves rolled up his forearms, revealing the heavy watch and tanned skin. Casually dressed, he looked even more dangerous. "Miss Margot," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "Welcome." "What is this? Did you buy out the place for the night?" she asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm as she sat. "I own the place," he replied simply, sitting across from her. "Privacy is the most valuable commodity." A chef appeared from the kitchen, served them wine and plates of food that Margot barely registered, and then disappeared again. They were alone. The tension between them was a third presence at the table, palpable and vibrant. "Let's dispense with the formalities, Mr. Gallo," Margot began, setting her silverware aside. "Why me? Why this entire charade?" Caspian swirled the wine in his glass, watching the red liquid cling to the crystal. His gray eyes rose to meet hers. "Because you were the first person in almost a decade who looked at me and didn't see a ghost or a vault," he said, his voice low and serious. "You looked at me in traffic and saw a man on a motorcycle. You challenged me. Your voice didn't tremble. There was no fear, no calculation. Just truth. It was refreshing." Margot felt a blush rise up her neck. She hated the reaction, the way her body betrayed her. "So, because of a 10-second flirtation, you manipulated the biggest contract of my career?" "I didn't manipulate. I steered," he corrected. "Your design was the best, the boldest. I just made sure it landed in the right hands. Mine." He leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze pinning her in place. "I want you to build my tower, Margot. I want your vision, your perfection. But I won't insult your intelligence by pretending that's all it is. By building for me, you are entering my world." "I don't want to enter your world," she retorted, her voice weaker than she intended. "You already did when you signed that paper," he said, not cruelly, just stating a fact. "The question now is not if, it's how. You have a choice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You can build the tower, collect your check, which will be obscenely large, and pretend you don't know where the money comes from. You can be the brilliant architect who looks the other way. Many people do. It's the safe choice." He took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving hers. "Or you can understand. You can understand what this building really means, what power is, and who you're really building for." He paused again. "I'm not offering you a job, Margot. I'm offering you a front-row seat." Margot's heart pounded. Fear and a strange, terrible fascination warred within her. He wasn't threatening her. He was recruiting her. He was testing her courage, her ambition. The part of her that had always wanted more, that drove her to be the best, felt dangerously drawn to the offer. "And why would you give me that choice?" she whispered. Caspian Gallo leaned back in his chair, the shadow of a smirk touching his lips. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because I suspect, Miss Margot," he said softly, "that you've never been the type to look the other way." The choice Caspian offered her hung in the air between them, heavy and iridescent like an oil slick on water. Margot didn't answer, not verbally, but her silence, the way she didn't stand up and walk out, the way her gaze remained locked on his, was an answer in itself, an answer he seemed to understand perfectly. The rest of the dinner proceeded in a tense truce. They talked about architecture, about the city. He was surprisingly knowledgeable, discussing the tension between historic preservation and modernism with a sharp intelligence. Margot found herself, to her horror, engaged in the conversation. The professional part of her, the architect, couldn't resist a mind that understood her art. It was seductive and terrifying in equal measure. She was sitting at a table with a monster, and they were discussing the beauty of an exposed steel beam. The following weeks established a new, bizarre normal. Margot focused on the initial stages of construction. The site, a prime piece of real estate near the river, was cleared and prepped with impressive efficiency. Caspian remained a phantom presence. Sometimes, she would see him across the street from the construction site, inside his black sedan, just watching. He never got out, never waved, but she knew he was there. It was a silent supervision that sent a chill down her spine. She clung to the choice he'd given her like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. I am the architect. I build. That is all. It was the lie she needed to keep going, the mental barrier she erected between her drafting table and the criminal empire that funded it. The barrier was about to be demolished. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was low and gray, promising rain. Margot was on site, wearing a hard hat and safety boots that looked absurd with her tailored trousers. She was discussing the placement of a main support girder with the lead engineer, a burly man named Frank. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, diesel, and the hum of heavy machinery. Her back was to the street, her finger pointing to a section of the blueprint. Frank, the stress analysis here looks too optimistic. I want a second check before. Her sentence was cut off by a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't construction noise. It was the sharp squeal of tires, followed by a series of dull, dry pops. Pop, 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 like faulty firecrackers. Frank froze, his face paling. The workers around them stopped, their heads turning in unison. The hum of construction was replaced by a sudden, ominous silence. Before Margot could process what was happening, a hand grabbed her arm with the force of a vice. It was one of Caspian's men. A face she had seen before, always at a distance. A man named Leo, with a thin scar above his eyebrow. He had never spoken to her before. "Down, now!" he growled, his voice a low thunder. He didn't wait for her to comply. He pulled her with brutal force, throwing her behind a pile of steel rebar just as chaos erupted. The sound of shattering glass split the air. One of the windows on the on-site office trailer exploded inward. Margot heard a sharp cry. More pops. She was crouched in the damp dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. The scent of gunpowder, acrid and metallic, mixed with the smell of impending rain. Leo was crouched in front of her, a human shield. From somewhere inside his suit jacket, he produced a gun. The sight of the black matte pistol in his hand made everything surreally, horribly real. This was not a movie. This was not a story. It all lasted maybe 20 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The only sound was the wind whistling through the unfinished steel beams and the frightened cry of someone in the distance. Leo remained tense for another few seconds, his head cocked, listening. Then, he relaxed minimally. "Stay here," he ordered, and moved, gun still in hand, toward the street. Margot couldn't obey. Trembling, she got to her feet, peeking over the pile of steel. On the street, a black sedan was stopped at an odd angle, its doors open. Two bodies lay on the asphalt beside it. Men in suits. Further down, another car squealed its tires and disappeared around a corner. She felt a wave of bile rise in her throat. The world spun. Her knees buckled. She leaned against the cold rebar, the metal biting into her palms. The smell of gunpowder and blood. It would be seared into her memory forever. 5 minutes later, the site was swarming with men in dark suits. They appeared from nowhere, moving with a calm, terrifying efficiency. They secured the area, tended to the wounded one of Caspian's men had taken a bullet in the shoulder, and managed the terrified workers. There were no police, no approaching sirens. This was a parallel universe, with its own rules and its own emergency services. Margot stood near the trailer, wrapped in a blanket someone had put over her shoulders, shaking uncontrollably. That's when she saw him. Caspian's car glided onto the site and came to a stop. He was out before the vehicle had fully halted. He wasn't wearing a suit, but dark trousers and a black leather jacket. He looked as if he had stepped directly out of her most recent nightmare. His face was a mask of cold fury. The usual calm was gone, replaced by a lethal stillness that was infinitely more frightening. His gray eyes were chips of ice. He strode past his men, his presence silencing all murmurs. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. His eyes swept the scene, absorbing every detail. Then, they landed on Margot. He walked toward her, each step deliberate. He stopped in front of her, so close she could smell the faint scent of rain and leather that clung to him. He didn't ask if she was okay. He reached out, not to touch her, but to brush away a stray strand of hair that had stuck to her dust-streaked face. The gesture was surprisingly gentle, a shocking contrast to the violence hanging in the air. "They shot at my sight, at you," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment of the universe. The idea that someone had dared to touch her seemed to offend him on a primal level. Margot couldn't speak. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with terror. The barrier in her mind, the lie that she was just the architect, had crumbled to dust. She wasn't a spectator in the front row. She was on the stage, and the play was a bloody tragedy. "That," Caspian said, his eyes never leaving hers, but his voice projecting so his men could hear, "was a mistake that will not go unanswered." In that moment, looking at the contained rage on his face, Margot understood. The choice he had given her was an illusion. There was no looking the other way. His world wasn't just around her. Now, because of her, it had burst into flames, and she was trapped in the center of the inferno. The violence of that day left an indelible mark. It wasn't a physical wound, but something deeper, a fracture in her perception of reality. Margot's world, once a place of logic and order, now contained the possibility of a sudden eruption of chaos. She heard the sound of squealing tires in her dreams and woke up to the phantom scent of gunpowder in her nostrils. Caspian drove her home himself. The silence in the car was thick, heavy with unspoken words. He didn't try to offer apologies or empty reassurances. He simply walked her to her apartment door, waited for her to get inside, and posted 2 of his men in her hallway. Guards or jailers. Margot wasn't sure. Margot. In the following days, his presence in her life became manifest. He was no longer watching from a distance. A car followed her discreetly to work. One of his men was always positioned in her building's lobby. He had wrapped her in a cocoon of security that felt, to her, indistinguishable from a cage. Her anger, once a cold, controlled flame, now burned uncontrollably, fueled by fear and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. On the 3rd night, she couldn't take it anymore. She called him, the number now saved in her phone under the name C, an abbreviation that felt absurdly intimate. "Get your men away from my door," she said without preamble when he answered. "No," the reply was calm and final. "I am not your property. I am not one of your things to protect." "No, you're not," he agreed, and for a moment she thought he had conceded. "You're the architect of my most important project, and someone tried to use you to get to me. The security is non-negotiable." "This isn't about security, it's about control. Your control!" she yelled, her voice breaking. "You dragged me into this." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, rougher. "Be ready in 10 minutes. We're going to talk." He didn't come in his sedan. He came on his motorcycle, the same Black Panther that had haunted her since the first day. Margot watched from her window as he parked, pulling off his helmet. He didn't take her to an empty restaurant or an impersonal office. He took her to an old, nearly empty whiskey bar on the south side, a place with dark wood and the smell of thyme. They sat in a secluded corner. He ordered 2 whiskeys, placing one in front of her. "I don't drink whiskey," she said, the challenge weak. "Tonight you do," he replied, not looking at her. He stared into the amber liquid in his glass for a long moment. The dim light of the bar carved shadows onto his face, accentuating the hard lines of his jaw. For the first time, Margot saw something beyond power and control in his eyes. She saw a deep weariness, a darkness that seemed ancient. "You said I dragged you into this," he began, his voice a low rumble. "You're wrong. I was born into this. You were an accident I tried to control." He took a sip of the whiskey, the movement slow and deliberate. "I had an older brother, Matteo," he said, and the mention of the name seemed to cost him a physical effort. He was the heir, the charming one, the diplomat. He was supposed to be the boss. I was the younger one, the shadow, the enforcer. That was our arrangement. He led. I protected. Margot sat in silence, the whiskey glass forgotten in her hand. This was the first crack she had seen in his armor. Matteo loved motorcycles. He taught me how to ride. It was our escape. When we were on the road, we weren't Vincent Gallo's sons. We were just two brothers. Free. He paused, his eyes fixed on a distant point. 7 years ago, the Drago family, our rivals, proposed a truce. Matteo, the diplomat, believed them. I, the shadow, did not. He went to the meeting. I was supposed to be with him, but my father sent me elsewhere. A lesson in hierarchy. The ice in his glass cracked, the sound loud in the silence. It was an ambush. They didn't just kill him. They made an example of him. Caspian's voice was devoid of emotion, which made it all the more chilling. That day I stopped being the younger brother, and I became what I am now. I inherited his empire and his revenge. He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw and deep that Margot felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. "I ride his bike," he said softly. "It's the only time I feel anything other than the weight of this crown. It's my penance, my only connection to the life that was stolen from me. The day I saw you in traffic, I was on my way back from the cemetery. It's the anniversary of his death." The air left Margot's lungs. The revelation hit her, rearranging all the pieces of her mental puzzle. Her flirtation hadn't just been an impulsive act. It had been a stone thrown into a deep well of grief and rage. "And you," he continued, his voice now a hoarse whisper. "You looked at me in that moment, and you didn't see a monster. You made a joke. You made me real. For an instant." The silence that followed was filled with a devastating understanding. The attraction between them wasn't just about power or danger. It was about a moment of unexpected humanity that he had been chasing ever since. Margot didn't know what to say. All her defenses, all her anger seemed trivial in the face of that raw confession. She reached her hand across the table, an instinct, and her fingers brushed the back of his hand. His skin was warm. The contact sent an electric shock through her. It was a small gesture, but it seemed to break an invisible barrier. Caspian looked down at her hand on his, then up at her face. His gaze was intense, ravenous. He stood, pulled her up by the hand, and led her out of the bar into the dark alley beside it. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall, a cold drizzle that clung to their skin. He pressed her back against the rough brick wall, trapping her with his body. One of his hands came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "You have no idea what you do to me, Margot," he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't hesitant. It was a kiss of surrender. A kiss that carried 7 years of pain, rage, and loneliness. It was desperate, intense, the collision of their two worlds finally crashing together without barriers. His stubble scraped her soft skin, a delicious contrast to the softness of his lips. He tasted of whiskey and rain, and something dangerously addictive. Margot should have pushed him away. She should have run. But instead, her arms rose and wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with the same ferocity, a release of all the fear and tension she had been holding inside. In that dark, rainy alley, in the arms of the most dangerous man in Chicago, she had never felt so terribly, dangerously alive. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. Caspian pulled back, just a few inches, enough for the cold night air to slip between them. They were both breathing heavily, their breath white clouds in the alley's darkness. The rain was falling harder, plastering Margot's hair to her face, running down her cheeks like tears. He stared at her, his gray eyes now dark as wet slate, turbulent with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It looked like a mix of desire and something close to regret, as if he had broken one of his own inviolable rules. Without a word, he took her hand and led her back to the motorcycle. The ride back to her apartment was a blur of city lights bleeding in the rain. Margot's body pressed against his broad, warm back, the leather of his jacket damp and slick beneath her fingers. He left her at her door, as before. But this time, when she turned to look at him, he was still there. His gaze followed her inside before the door closed. A silent link she felt long after she was alone in the quiet of her apartment. That kiss changed everything, and nothing. The guards were still there. The danger hadn't vanished. The Valeriano Tower still needed to be built. But the dynamic between them had shifted. The line between captor and protector, between client and something more, had dissolved into a thrilling gray area. They developed a strange, unspoken routine. Almost every evening he would pick her up, sometimes on the motorcycle, sometimes in the sedan. They never went to public places. They ate at empty restaurants he owned, or at his apartment, a vast, impersonal loft atop a converted warehouse, with floor-to-ceiling windows and sparse furniture, as if he were a temporary occupant in his own life. In these meetings, they rarely spoke of what he did. His empire was a silent elephant in the room. Instead, they talked about architecture, about history, about books. Margot discovered he had an incisive mind, a ravenous curiosity that contradicted the brutality of his reputation. She found herself revealing things about herself, her ambitions, her frustrations, the burden of always having to be the strongest, the smartest. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world. It was a dangerous intimacy, built on a foundation of violence and secrets. Margot knew she was playing with fire. Every shared laugh, every prolonged glance, was a step deeper into a labyrinth from which she might never escape. She was becoming addicted to the adrenaline of his presence, to the paradoxical calm she felt when he was near. The man who had turned her world upside down was becoming its center. "Who am I to you, Caspian?" she asked one night. They were in his loft, the city glittering below them like a carpet of fallen diamonds. He was standing by the window, a silhouette against the light. He turned to face her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "You are a complication," he said, his voice low. "The most interesting complication I've ever had." "That's not an answer." He moved closer to her, stopping inches away. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You are the architect. You are the woman who wasn't afraid of me. And you are the only person who knows my brother's name." His voice was a rough murmur. "I haven't yet decided what that makes you." He leaned in and kissed her. This time, there was no desperation of the rain, only a slow, burning hunger. His hand slid to the nape of her neck, fingers tangling in her hair, while his other hand rested on the small of her back, a gesture that was both possessive and protective. Margot surrendered to the kiss, to the chaos it represented. It was easier than thinking. But the reality of his world was never far away. One evening, she was at his loft waiting for him when one of his men, Leo, came in. His face was pale in the dim light. "Miss Margot, you need to come with me now." "What happened? Where's Caspian?" Panic turned her blood to ice. "There was an incident. He's fine. But he asked me to take you somewhere safe." Leo led her through a series of service hallways and freight elevators to what looked like a luxury bunker in the building's sublevels. Only when the heavy steel door closed behind them did he seem to relax. It was then she noticed it. There was a dark, wet stain on his shirt sleeve. Blood. "What happened?" she repeated, her voice a whisper. Leo hesitated, his eyes avoiding hers. "The Dragos. They didn't appreciate our response to the attack at the construction site." Margot's mind raced. Our response. She didn't want to know the details, but the images her imagination conjured were worse than any description. Caspian didn't appear until nearly dawn. When he entered the bunker, he looked like a ghost. His suit was rumpled. There was a small cut on his cheek, and his eyes were empty. The storm had passed, leaving a dead, terrifying calm in its wake. He saw her, and a spark of life returned to his face. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. His body was tense as a steel wire. She could smell the faint scent of smoke and something metallic and sick on him. She said nothing, just held him back, her hands flat against his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. In that moment, she was not the victim or the accomplice. She was his anchor, the one piece of his world that was not stained with blood. He pulled away, cupping her face in his hands. "They will never touch you again," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fury. "I swear it." Looking into the darkness in his eyes, Margot realized the terrible truth. The war with the Dragos was no longer just about business or old revenge. Now, it was about her. Her existence in his world had made him vulnerable, and his reaction to that vulnerability was not to retreat. It was to strike back with a ferocity that would shake the city to its foundations. The calm in the eye of the storm was over, and the coming tempest had her name at its center. After the night of the incident, a strange, ominous quiet descended upon Margot's life. It was the calm before a violent storm. The construction of the Valeriano Tower continued at an accelerated pace, the steel skeleton rising toward the sky, a monument indifferent to the war being waged in its shadows. But to Margot, every erected beam felt like part of a cage being built around her. Caspian became more distant, more consumed. Their nightly meetings grew rarer, and when they were together, he was physically present, but his mind was elsewhere, planning, calculating. The darkness in his eyes deepened. Margot found herself watching him sleep in the few hours before dawn, his face in repose looking younger, almost vulnerable. It was in these moments that she felt a terrifying pang of tenderness. It was madness. It was wrong. And yet, it was undeniably real. She hated herself for it, for the weakness, for the way her heart now beat differently when he entered a room. She, the architect of control, had lost control of the only thing that truly mattered: herself. The Drago family, led by a brutal old guard boss named Silvio Drago, interpreted Caspian's silence as weakness. They saw Margot's presence as a diversion, a distraction that had softened the shadow. It was a monumental miscalculation. They didn't understand that they hadn't found a weakness. They had given Caspian something he hadn't had in a long time, something to lose, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. The attack came on a mundane day, a Wednesday. Margot had dismissed her driver bodyguard for a few hours, a small act of rebellion to visit a specialty architecture bookstore, an old haven of hers. It was a stupid mistake, born from the frustration of her guarded life. She was leaving the store, the scent of paper and dust still on her clothes, when a black van screeched to a halt beside her. The side door slid open, and before she could even scream, a strong arm wrapped around her, a leather-gloved hand clamping over her mouth. The smell was of leather and a cheap antiseptic. She was dragged into the vehicle's darkness. The panic was a blinding white flash in her mind. She fought, kicking and squirming, but it was useless. A rough fabric hood was pulled over her head, plunging her into a total, suffocating blackness. The only things she could feel were the motion of the van, the smell of mildew, and the muffled sound of male voices speaking in Italian. Fear was a living thing in her throat, a metallic taste in her mouth. The sound of her own heart was a deafening thunder in her ears. When they finally stopped, she was pulled out and guided across an uneven floor. The air was cold and damp. The hood was ripped off. She was in some kind of abandoned warehouse. Faint light came from a few industrial lamps hanging from the high, rusty ceiling. The place smelled of decay and standing water. Several men stood around, their faces hard and disinterested. Sitting in a chair, like a king on a makeshift throne, was an older man with graying hair and an expensive suit that looked out of place in this environment. Silvio Drago. He looked her over with small, cunning eyes. "The architect," he said, his voice raspy. "You've caused a lot of trouble. The shadow has gone sentimental. A pity." Margot said nothing. Her mind, despite the terror, was working furiously. She could not show fear. Fear was a currency, and she would give them nothing. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a calm she did not feel. "You've made a great mistake," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Drago laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "No, my dear. The mistake was his. The day he decided you were worth a war." He motioned to one of his men. "Call him. Tell him we have his prize. Tell him to come to the docks alone. We'll finish what we started with his brother." As the man dialed the number, a thought, cold and clear as ice, formed in Margot's mind. They think they're in control. They thought Caspian was like them, driven by old codes and predictable impulses. But she knew him. She had seen his strategic mind at work as they discussed the complexities of a blueprint. He wasn't a king in their chess game. He was the entire board. The kidnapping wasn't the Dragos' checkmate. It was the trap Caspian had been waiting for them to spring. The call was made. The demand was delivered. Margot watched Drago's men, the arrogance on their faces, the certainty of victory. They were expecting a showdown, an exchange, an honorable bloodbath between families. They were expecting the Caspian they knew from stories, the vengeful son. That is not what happened. There was no frontal assault, no siege. There was only silence, a silence that stretched. The minutes dragged on, turning the men's arrogance into nervousness. Drago began to pace, impatient. "Where is he?" he snarled. And then, a sound. Not from outside, from inside the warehouse. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A metallic click from the high shadows above them, in the ceiling rafters. One of Drago's men looked up. His shout was cut off by a soft thud, and he crumpled to the floor. Chaos erupted. The men drew their guns, firing wildly into the shadows. But they were shooting at ghosts. One by one they fell. Not in a hail of gunfire, but in precise silent attacks from all sides. It was a hunt, an execution. Caspian's men had infiltrated the warehouse hours, perhaps days before. They weren't attacking. They were just cleaning. Silvio Drago, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, grabbed Margot, using her as a shield and dragging her toward a door at the back. "He won't shoot you," he screamed at the shadows. The back door burst open with a bang, but it wasn't an exit. Caspian stood there, alone. He wasn't wearing body armor or carrying a rifle. He was just standing, motionless, dressed in black, his hands empty at his sides. He looked less like a man and more like a personification of retribution itself. His face was calm, utterly devoid of emotion, and that was the most terrifying thing Margot had ever seen. He looked at Drago, but his gaze passed right through him, landing on Margot. In that look, she saw a silent promise. "Let her go, Silvio." Caspian's voice was low, almost conversational, but it cut the air like broken glass. "Or what? You'll kill me," Drago sneered, the barrel of his gun pressed to Margot's temple. "You've gone soft, Gallo. Worrying about a woman." Caspian took a step forward, into the light. "You killed my brother because you thought he was soft, and now you will die because you think I am." He took another step. "Your family's mistake is that you never learn." And then Margot saw it. Drago's gaze flickered. His eyes widened in terror, but he wasn't looking at Caspian. He was looking at something behind him. From the shadows behind Caspian, two figures emerged silently. Leo and another man. They hadn't been there a second before. The game was over. Drago never stood a chance. He was a dead man from the moment he had touched her. Seeing the defeat in his eyes, Margot acted. She drove her elbow back, hard, into Drago's stomach. The air rushed out of him in a grunt. His grip loosened for a split second. It was enough. She threw herself to the side, tumbling onto the concrete floor. The sound of two silenced gunshots echoed in the warehouse. Dry, final. Margot lay on the floor, breathless, her heart pounding wildly. Everything fell silent. Then, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but the hand was gentle, It was Caspian. He knelt beside her, his face still a mask. But his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a relief so profound it was almost painful to see. He had not rescued her like a knight in shining armor. He had reclaimed her, like a dark king, taking back what was his. And in the silence of that warehouse, surrounded by the carnage that had been unleashed in her name, Margot realized the line she had been trying to draw between his world and hers had been erased forever. There was no longer his world and her world. There was only their world. And it was a terribly dark place. The ride back from the warehouse was conducted in a thick, heavy silence. Margot sat in the back of Caspian's sedan, wrapped in his suit jacket, which smelled of the cold night, ozone, and him. He sat beside her, not touching her, but his presence was a solid, grounding force in the darkness. She was no longer shaking. The terror had given way to a strange, empty calm. She had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had become terrifyingly familiar. He didn't take her to her apartment. He took her to his. In the loft, he guided her to the spacious bathroom, all black marble and glass, and turned on the shower, releasing a cloud of hot steam. "Stay as long as you need," he said softly, his voice hoarse. His eyes scanned her face, searching for cracks, for damage. "I'll be right outside." Under the hot water, Margot stripped away the grime, the fear, and the warehouse's smell of decay. But the stain was internal, something the water couldn't wash away. When she emerged, wrapped in a plush robe that was far too big for her, she found him in the same position, standing just outside the door, like a sentinel. There was a glass of whiskey in his hand. She took the glass from his hand and drank a long swallow, the liquid burning down her throat, a welcome heat that spread through her chest. She said nothing. There were no words. She simply walked to him and hugged him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, one of his hands coming up to cradle the back of her head. It was an embrace that held no passion, but something deeper. It was the hug of two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage. For the first time, she felt his shoulders relax, a tension he must have carried for years finally dissipating. His war, his revenge for his brother, was over. That night, she slept in his bed, a vast space with dark gray sheets. He lay beside her, on top of the covers, still fully dressed. He made no move to initiate anything. He just lay there, watching her, his presence a silent promise that nothing would hurt her again. And in the silence of that night, Margot understood that the safety she felt with him was the most dangerous thing of all. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding, for the city and for her. The gang war, as the press called it, ended as suddenly as it began. With the Drago family decapitated, Caspian's empire consolidated. He became the unquestioned power, no longer a shadow, but a gravitational force in Chicago's underworld. For Margot, the rebuilding was internal. The trauma didn't disappear, but she integrated it. It became part of who she was. She returned to work on the Valeriano Tower with a new focus, a new hardness. She was no longer the naive architect. She knew who she was building for. She knew what the tower truly symbolized: power, permanence, victory. And she poured herself into making it the most magnificent fortress the city had ever seen. Her relationship with Caspian evolved into a complex partnership. They were lovers, yes, but they were more than that. They were confidants. He trusted her in a way he trusted no one else, discussing his legitimate businesses with her, valuing her strategic mind. And she, in turn, found in him the only person who understood the darkness she had glimpsed, both in the world and within herself. She watched him change. With his revenge finally settled, some of the darkness in his eyes receded. He smiled more. Not the wry smirks of before, but genuine smiles that reached his eyes. She was the cause of them. The responsibility and the power of that both scared and thrilled her. A year after the kidnapping, the Valeriano Tower was nearly complete. It was a masterpiece, a blade of glass and steel that sliced the sky, reflecting the city in its 1,000 facets. It was Margot's legacy, but it was also Caspian's throne. On a clear, cold autumn night, he took her to the top. They rode a construction elevator to the highest floor, still a raw space of concrete and exposed girders, open to the elements. The wind whistled around them, a lonely, mournful sound. The city stretched out below, a sea of glittering lights under a velvet dark sky sprinkled with stars. It was a breathtaking view, the view of a god. They stood in silence for a long time, just watching. "It's almost finished," Margot said, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "We're almost finished," he corrected her, turning to face her. The city light carved his face, making him look both familiar and strange. He looked like a Roman emperor, forged in shadow and power. "Margot," he began, his voice serious, "I never asked you to come into my world. But you're in it now. You've seen what I am, the worst of me." He took a step toward her, taking her hands in his. They were cold. "The war's over, the debt is paid, and now, you have a choice. A real one this time." Margot's heart began to beat faster. She knew what was coming. "I can give you anything," he said, his voice an intense murmur. "Money, a new identity, a new life anywhere in the world you want. You can walk away. Forget all of this. Forget me. I will make sure you are safe and free. Forever." The offer hung in the cold air between them. Freedom. The chance to go back to being just Margot, the architect. A life without the smell of gunpowder, without guards at her door, without the darkness in the eyes of the man she loved. She loved him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't fascination. It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. It was love. A complicated, dangerous, fire-forged love, but love nonetheless. "Or," he continued, his grip on her hands tightening, "you can stay." He gestured to the city below them. "And this city, this view, this power, will be as much yours as it is mine." He wasn't offering a ring. He wasn't offering marriage. He was offering an empire, a throne beside his own. Margot looked away from him, out at the stunning panorama. The city lights looked like jewels, cold and hard and beautiful. She, who had always sought control through straight lines and perfect plans, now understood. True power wasn't avoiding chaos. It was having the courage to stand in the center of it and call it your own. She remembered the woman she had been, stuck in traffic, frustrated with her perfectly controlled life. The woman who had flirted with danger out of sheer boredom. If only she had known. She turned back to Caspian. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She looked into his eyes, the storm that was now her safe harbor. And she made her decision. The wind howled around them, a ghostly choir at the top of the world. Caspian waited, his face a mask of impassivity. But Margot could see the tension in the line of his jaw, the depth in his eyes that betrayed the vulnerability of his offer. He had laid his empire, and more importantly himself, at her feet. For the first time, the shadow was completely exposed to the light. Margot pulled her hands from his. It was a small gesture, but she saw a flash of pain in his eyes, the instant acceptance of rejection. He thought she was pulling away. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the small space that remained between them. She raised her hand, not to push away, but to touch his face. His skin was cold from the wind, his stubble gently scraping her palm. It was the face of the man who had terrified her, intrigued her, and finally, captured her. "When I was a child," she said, her voice clear and steady above the sound of the wind, "I was terrified of heights. I used to have nightmares that I was falling." His eyes searched hers, trying to understand where she was going with this. "I built my entire life on the ground, Caspian. Safe, predictable. Every brick, every line, meticulously planned to avoid any chance of a fall." She smiled, a small, sad smile for the woman she used to be. "And then you showed up, on your motorcycle, and you pushed me off the cliff. He remained silent, his gaze locked on hers, allowing her to lead the conversation to its inevitable conclusion. "I've spent the last year in freefall," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "and it has been the most terrifying and the most real thing I have ever experienced. You didn't just show me your world, you showed me mine, and it was a gilded cage I had built for myself." She took another step, her body now pressed against his. He didn't move, as if he feared any movement might break the spell. "You ask me if I want to walk away," she whispered, her gaze intense. "Go back to the ground, back to safety, but you don't understand." Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, moving up into his dark hair. "I've discovered I'm not afraid of falling. And the view from up here," she leaned in, her lips a breath away from his, "is spectacular." And with that, she kissed him. It was a kiss unlike all the others. It held none of the desperation of the rainy alley, none of the slow-burning hunger of their secret nights. It was a kiss of choice, of power, of acceptance. It was calm, deep, and absolute. It was the signature on a new kind of contract, one sealed not with ink, but with soul. When the kiss ended, she pulled back slightly, just enough to look into his eyes. The storm in them had calmed. In its place was a relief and an adoration so overwhelming it left her breathless. The Dark King had found his queen. "Margot," he murmured, his voice hoarse, as if it were the only word he knew. She smiled, a genuine smile full of a new, terrifying confidence. "I think the tower needs some minor adjustments," she said, the echo of her words from the very beginning hanging between them. "The top floor. It won't be an office. It will be our home." He laughed, a real, deep sound that reverberated through her chest. The sound of a man who had spent years living in the shadows and had finally found his son. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around, the sound of his laughter mixing with the wind. In that moment, on top of the city that now belonged to them, they were not the mafia boss and his architect. They were just a man and a woman who had found in each other a dangerous and perfect kind of home. Their story would not be a fairy tale. It would be a saga, written in steel and shadow, cemented in power and loyalty. There would be more dangers, more enemies, more nights when the weight of their empire would threaten to crush them. But now they would face it all together. Margot hadn't simply accepted Caspian's world. She had claimed it. The woman who once controlled blueprints would now help control an empire. The ambitious executive had found the peak of her ambition. And the architect had finally designed a life big enough for herself. As he set her back down, she turned with him, no longer with her back to the city, but at his side, both of them looking out at the horizon. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, a gesture of possession and partnership. The city lights glittered below, indifferent and eternal, and on top of the tallest tower, two figures stood against the night sky. Not the echo and the shadow anymore, but two flames, joined, burning brightly against the dark. Their reign was just beginning.